everybody. I'm Zack Steele. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at UC Berkeley. The work I'll be presenting today is primarily from my doctoral work at UC Davis, and we'll be kind of trying to get at the implications of changing wildfire regimes in California and the West more generally, and what we're likely to see in terms of changes in the bird and bat community because of it. We are, and it won't be a surprise that many people in this session, watching this session, the fire regimes are changing across the West, and there's kind of two main drivers of that: climate change and fire suppression, especially in the dry forests that used to get a lot of low to moderate severity fire, and we've been putting out those fires. And so in terms of wildlife and the effects of wildlife habitat, there's a few things that we're kind of focused on, and one is, if we're putting out fires, and there's just less burning in general. But when it does burn, it tends to burn at more high severity than it did historically. And then we're also concerned that if we're starting to get kind of more of these big mega fires, we're getting large patches of high severity contrasted with these areas that haven't burned in 100 years. And so the habitat heterogeneity is declining, or the pyrodiversity variation in fire history is declining. So these all could potentially influence wildlife habitat and occurrence. So there's a number of different components of fire regimes. These two different studies kind of focus on different parts of that. The first, looking at bat occurrence and richness in the Sierra, is really focused on this severity part, and then a little bit of the spatial complexity of severity, or the variation in severity. And so each of these components affects habitat structure or habitat quality, and then wildlife down indirectly. So we often focus on severity because it has a really big impact on habitat. So just showing the kind of two contrasts here. On the left, if you get a surface fire that goes through and just consumes the fuels in the surface, such as shrubs and small trees, you're going to get low severity effects. And that means that not many of the canopy trees are going to die. Most of those big fire resistant trees are going to still be there after the fire. Contrasting that with high severity fire, you get a crown fire coming through and it consumes all of the vegetation, and you're left with kind of a snag forest, at least immediately after the fire. So pretty different habitats and potentially accommodating different species. So for bats, we're looking at this full range of burn severity. So from unburned, where you have the fire, we're outside of the burn perimeter and the fire hasn't changed at all, to high severity, we have a completely stand replacement, killing all the trees, potentially turning that over into a more early sterile habitat such as shrublands. And we're also laying on top of this idea of pyrodiversity. So pyrodiversity in general is kind of variation in fire regime characteristics or fire history. So variation in burn severity is just one component of that, but these two kind of toy landscapes there illustrate this. These have the same average burn severity across the landscape, but obviously the one on the left, which is only burning at moderate severity, has a lot less variation in that as opposed to the one on the right. So if you have low to moderate to high all in the same landscape, and there's a greater mix of different habitat types, potential niches for different species, and the theory is that more pyrodiversity creates more biodiversity. So we're testing that with bats as well. And we're using acoustic recordings of bats, so we're recording their echolocation calls and using specialized software to classify those calls to species to get at occurrence, and we're using occupancy models which account for imperfect detection. Now, going into this, we kind of expect to see this variation in species response to different burn severity. One way to classify forest-associated bat species is into clutter-tolerant species. These are often smaller bats with kind of shorter wings that are not super fast but can maneuver really well in cluttered environments like forests. On the other end, you have these open-adapted species which have long wings, often higher body mass, super fast, but can't really turn in tight situations. So we can kind of expect that those open adapted species might show up more in high severity areas, clutter adapted maybe in more lower to unburned severity areas. However, we did see a little bit of variation, but not quite as much as we expected. And many of these species actually had this positive relationship with burn severity. So a lot of these are showing up where you had complete or near complete mortality of the vegetation, which is a little bit surprising. We did have one species that showed the opposite effect. So the small-footed myotis is showing up more often in unburned or low severity areas, and a couple species that kind of peak at mid severity. And this general trend of most of these species having a positive relationship includes some of those clutter tolerant species. So the fringe myotis, the third from the left on top there, we kind of expected them to prefer these denser habitats, but they're showing up more in the open areas. And what I think is happening here is that because we've been putting out fires so successfully for so long, that the forests are not only excluding these open adapted species, but they're also starting to exclude some of these more clutter adapted species because it's just more dense and more cluttered than they were used to historically. So if we bring this up to the community level, now we're looking at species counts, richness, and how that relates to severity and pyrodiversity. So see a similar trend as we did with a lot of those species, that richness is increasing with more severity. And then the different lines drawn on there show different levels of pyrodiversity. So the solid line is high pyrodiversity, kind of 2 standard deviations above the mean, and then low diversity is the dashed dot line below. So takeaway from this is the least amount of species are found in those unburned areas. We found about 8 bats on average. And then that is maximized kind of at moderate to high severity and high pyrodiversity at about 11 species. So back to what does changing fire regimes mean for this? So it seems that for bats at least, the real problem is the fire suppression. So these areas that haven't seen fire in 100 years and are just kind of homogeneous, dense forest. These are the least speciose areas in terms of bats, the least lowest quality habitat potentially. So if we are seeing an increase in burn severity overall, that's not necessarily a bad thing for these species. However, if this increase in burn severity is occurring, is creating less habitat heterogeneity, so now we're getting unburned, large patches of unburned forest, and then high severity patches next to each other, then that's not necessarily the optimum for bats either. To put this in context of kind of the broader biodiversity, so with bats, we're seeing a more or less a positive relationship with burn severity. With birds and small mammals, it's a little bit more balanced. Some like these high severity areas, some like lower severity, some don't like fire at all. Understory plants seem to peak at kind of moderate severity, and lichens would prefer that you didn't burn at all. So there's a big variation in how different taxa respond to severity. Okay, so pivoting a little bit to birds here, now we're going to try to isolate a couple of these different characteristics of our regime. So we're just looking at high severity now, kind of keeping that constant. And we're looking at the change in bird diversity over time since fire, and then with different sizes of or locations within these high severity patches. So if you burn a forest at high severity, kills all the trees, you're left with the kind of a snag forest that eventually will start to recover as kind of herbaceous to shrubland in the first couple of years. If there's successful conifer regeneration, you get young forest or a mix of shrubs and young trees. And then eventually we'll get back to more of a late seral forested state. If we completely suppress fires, then that'll again become this kind of overly dense forest. So this clearly changes the habitat for species, and we expect that birds would respond to that too. And now I mentioned we're just focusing on these high severity areas. We looked at 27 fires across the Sierra Nevada, lots of points just within these high severity patches. So if you think about these to consider these 2 yellow points, locally it's the same type of habitat right after the fire. It's snag forest, but a little bit broader landscape, the one near the edge is going to have a little bit more habitat heterogeneity versus the one in the interior. So you might see different species there. And this other thing is, as vegetation succession proceeds over time, you might see these diverge a little bit more also. If you're near an edge or in a small patch, you're more likely to get successful conifer regeneration. Whereas if you're in a large patch, the edges might have conifers coming back, but the middle of these might be stuck in a shrubland for a while. So we use multi-species occupancy models for this. As I said, 27 species, kind of looked at a range of 1 to 30 years since fire. What we're showing here is overall species richness and how that changes over time and with distance to edge. So the blue curve there are surveys or bird communities that are expected 10 meters away from an edge. The yellow is 250 meters away from the edge. So you can think of those as kind of edge communities versus interior. So the first thing to note is that those edge communities have a lot more species, or have more species, kind of across that time frame. And the second thing here is that those edge species gain a lot more species over time. So they start out 1 year after the fire, on average, having about 18 species. 19 species, and then after about 20 years or so, they maximize at approximately 23 species, so gaining on average 4 species over that time. The interior patches start at 17 species and maximize at 18 species, so they're only gaining about 1 species, so that they're not accumulating at the same rate. So the distance is affecting avian succession as well as just the magnitude of species diversity. So the other thing you might ask, okay, so maybe there are fewer birds in these patch interiors, but maybe they're complementing the edge communities, and overall you have more species. And so you can think about, okay, is the beta diversity of these interiors bigger than the edges? And the answer seems to be no. The beta diversity, the dissimilarity from any given community from the average community is the same regardless of where you are. The time component seems to matter a little bit, so you have the most dissimilar or the most unique species after about 7 years, which then declines over time. To dive in a little bit more beyond those kind of top line numbers, we'll look at different nesting guilds here. These first two are tree nesters and primary cavity nesters, just think woodpeckers. And you see the same pattern with respect to distance. So the edge communities have more species as opposed to the interiors. This isn't surprising for the tree nesters. If you're killing all the trees, there's, you're losing an important resource for those species. So there's just less of that in the interior of these patches. It's a little bit more surprising for the primary cavity nesters because a lot of these woodpeckers will use dead trees, snags, as for foraging and nesting. And you can see that for those, the difference between those isn't that great at the beginning of like 1 year after the fire. They're pretty similar, but as time goes on, those diverge a lot more. You're starting to lose some of these primary cavity nesters in these interiors, where along the edges maybe they're switching towards to live trees, or you have new trees dying to replace those along the edges. It's a different story for the secondary cavity nesters. So the birds that come in and use the cavities that the woodpeckers made, ground nesters and shrub nesters. So now you see kind of this hump shape pattern where species or guild richness is maximized sometime after the fire. You see less of an effect to the distance. A little bit of a negative effect with distance for the secondary cavity nesters, similar to the others, not much for ground nesters, not much for shrub nesters. So kind of the important thing for me here is that lack of an effect for the shrub nesters. We might expect that they really love the interiors of these patches. We just have lots of contiguous shrub habitat, but it seems that at least in terms of numbers of shrub nesters, it's the same whether you have shrubs on the edge or shrubs in the middle. They don't seem to care. So you're not really getting this trade-off. You're just losing species. All right, so if we're seeing more high severity fire, we're going to expect a shift in which species are out there, both at the broader biodiversity in terms of bats, plants, other things, but in terms of birds as well. But if we're getting bigger high severity patches, we're also just losing species. We're not getting that nice mix of habitat types, that pyrodiversity that creates different niches for a lot of these species. So what should we be shooting for? What's the optimum here? And first is we probably need more fire on the landscape, at least compared to what we have been getting. This year is, perhaps an exception. We've gotten plenty of fire this year. But this, importantly, should emulate the natural fire regime. So you're putting in prescribed fire where you can, and using managed wildfire, naturally ignited fires that are burning under moderate conditions to create a lot of this low severity, low moderate dominant severity with some high severity in there, and then more of a kind of a mix of habitat types. And importantly, we want to limit the amount of huge areas of unburned forest and huge areas of high severity, and get more of this mix of fire histories and severities in there. So I'd like to thank my co-authors and lots of field technicians and biologists that collected these data over the years. The Forest Service provided most of the funding along with UC Davis for this project. And then also thank my collaborators at Point Blue and my current collaborators at UC Berkeley. All right, thank you. If you have any questions, please leave it in the appropriate place.